Welcome to my channel.
The sky over Lochdubh was the colour of a bruised plum, heavy with the threat of a snowstorm that had been lingering over the Minch for 3 days. PC Hamish Macbeth stood on the edge of the sea wall, his lanky frame hunched against a wind that felt as though it had been sharpened on a whetstone. He wasn't looking for crime, he was looking for dinner. Specifically, he was eyeing a particular patch of dark water where he knew a fine, fat lobster had taken up residence in a crevice. "Quiet now, Lugs," Hamish murmured to the dog at his heels. Lugs, a creature of indeterminate breed with ears that seemed to pick up radio signals from the continent, let out a soft, pessimistic huff. Hamish was supposed to be at the police station, or perhaps patrolling the village to ensure the residents were properly displaying their tax discs. Instead, he was engaged in the delicate art of looking busy while doing nothing. To the casual observer, he was merely a slow-witted Highland bobby staring at the tide. In reality, his mind was a sharp instrument, currently calculating the exact moment to deploy his illegal lobster pot before the mist rolled in and obscured the shoreline entirely. The peace was shattered by a sound that did not belong in the gentle rhythm of the Highlands, the high-pitched, self-important whine of a sports car engine. A neon-orange Porsche, looking like a radioactive lozenge, skidded around the corner of the harbour, splashing a wave of icy seawater over Hamish's boots. The driver, a man wearing a cashmere coat that cost more than Hamish's annual salary, stepped out. This was Barnaby St. John, a Sassenach, who had recently purchased the old Drumnadrochit estate with the stated intention of bringing culture to the cul-de-sacs of the north. He was a man of immense wealth and even greater arrogance, possessing the kind of booming English accent that seemed designed to startle sheep at 50 paces. "You! Constable!" St. John shouted, waving a manicured hand at the horizon. "I've been trying to find the station for 20 minutes. Is everyone in this god-forsaken village illiterate or simply deaf? I want to report a trespasser. Some local ruffian was playing the bagpipes near my library window at 4 in the morning. It was an assault on the senses." Hamish turned slowly, his hazel eyes wide with a look of vacant bovine curiosity. He adjusted his cap, allowing a lock of ginger hair to fall over his forehead. "A piper, you say? Och, that would be the wandering piper, most likely. He's a bit of a tradition, sir, like the rain or the midges. I don't care if he's the Loch Ness monster in a kilt," St. John snapped, his face reddening. "I want him to move along. This isn't a theme park, it's my private residence. And why aren't you in uniform? You look like you've been pulled through a hedge backwards." Hamish looked down at his worn wax jacket and squelching boots. "I'm on undercover duty, sir, very secret. I'm observing the migration patterns of the local crustacea, for the government, you understand." St. John let out a sound of pure disgust. "Useless. Utterly useless. I shall be writing to your chief constable. I expect results, Macbeth, not fairy tales about pipers and lobsters." He climbed back into his orange monstrosity and roared away, leaving a scent of expensive cologne and exhaust fumes in the crisp Highland air. Hamish watched him go, a small, sceptical smile playing on his lips. He knew men like Barnaby St. John. They arrived in Lochdubh with big plans and loud voices, only to find that the mountains didn't care for their money and the locals didn't care for their opinions. "He's in a great hurry to be miserable, Lugs," Hamish whispered, turning back to the water. But the lobster would have to wait. There was a strange stillness settling over the village, a silence that felt heavier than the approaching snow. For a moment, Hamish thought he heard a faint, dying wheeze of a bagpipe drone coming from the direction of the estate, a sound like a wounded animal taking its final breath. He felt a familiar, annoying prickle at the back of his neck. His day was ruined, his dinner was escaping, and if his instincts were right, Lochdubh was about to host a guest that was far more permanent than a London socialite. The orange Porsche had barely vanished into the encroaching Har when that peculiar wheeze of the bagpipes came again, thinner and more desperate than before. Hamish sighed, a sound of profound weariness that seemed to vibrate through his lanky frame. He looked down at the dark, swirling water where his lobster dinner was likely laughing at him from the safety of its crevice, then at Lugs, who was already trotting toward the village road with his ears cocked in an expectant manner. The dog knew that when Hamish's neck began to prickle, the quiet life was about to be replaced by the frantic, unwanted demands of the law. He followed Lugs, his boots squelching with a rhythmic, mournful sound that echoed the general mood of the day. The road toward the Drumnadrochit estate was a winding, treacherous thing, lined with ancient stone walls and overhanging gorse that seemed to claw at the mist. As Hamish crested the final rise, the grand Victorian pile of the manor house loomed out of the grey like a tombstone. It was a house that had always looked uncomfortable in the Highlands, all jagged gables and red brick that clashed with the heather. Now it looked positively sinister. The front gates were wide open, and the silence was no longer musical. It was the sort of silence that felt as though the world was holding its breath. Hamish didn't head for the front door, he followed the sound. Behind the library wing, there was a decorative topiary garden, a new addition by St. John that the villagers had already dubbed the Sassenach's shrubbery. The bushes had been clipped into the shapes of lions and eagles, though in the gathering gloom they looked more like deformed monsters. In the centre of this manicured nightmare was a stone fountain, currently dry and filled with dead leaves, and slumped over the edge of the fountain was the wandering piper. He was a local character known as Old Rory, a man whose relationship with the bagpipes was as passionate as it was technically deficient. He wore a kilt of a tartan that no clan would ever claim, and a bonnet that looked as though it had been chewed by a Highland cow. But Rory wasn't playing now. He was draped over the stone basin in a position that suggested a sudden and catastrophic loss of dignity. His pipes were tangled around him like the tentacles of a giant squid, the tartan bag deflated and hissing its last bit of air through a cracked drone. Hamish approached cautiously, Lugg staying a respectful distance behind. He didn't need a medical degree to see that Rory was past the help of a dream and a warm fire. The old man's face was a startling shade of blue, and his eyes were wide, fixed on something unseen in the mist. But it wasn't the death itself that caught Hamish's eye. It was the way it had happened. Rory wasn't just dead. He had been humiliated. Stuck into the blowpipe of his beloved bagpipes was a large, half-eaten Cornish pasty, the sort of mass-produced, yellow-crusted monstrosity that St. John was known to import from a London deli. It was a joke, a cruel and bizarre mockery of the old man's trade. "Oh, Rory," Hamish whispered, his voice soft with a genuine sorrow. "You deserved better than to go out with a pesty in your pipes." He knelt by the body, his long fingers hovering over the stone. He didn't touch anything yet, he simply looked. He observed the way the grass had been flattened, not by a struggle, but by a heavy, deliberate tread. He noticed a small, silver foil wrapper, the kind used for expensive chocolates, tangled in the heather nearby. And he noticed that Rory's pockets had been turned inside out, though his battered old wallet, containing a few greasy pound notes, was lying on the ground untouched. This wasn't a robbery. It was a message, or perhaps a fit of pique that had turned lethal. "What do you make of it, Lugs?" Hamish asked. The dog let out a low, mournful cry. Before Hamish could investigate further, the library window slid open with a sharp, expensive-sounding click. Barnaby St. John bent down, glass of amber liquid in his hand. He looked down at the scene with an expression of mild annoyance, as though he were looking at a bit of litter that the gardener had failed to clear. "Is he still there?" St. John shouted, his voice booming across the garden. "I told you to move him along, Macbeth. Is he drunk?" "I won't have the help finding a vagrant passed out in the topiary. It's bad for morale." Hamish stood up slowly, his face carefully wiped of all emotion. He looked up at the wealthy man in the window, his hazel eyes cold and clear. "He's not drunk, Mr. St. John. He's dead, and I think he's been murdered." St. John didn't flinch. He simply took a sip of his drink and checked his watch. "Dead? How inconvenient. I have guests arriving for dinner in 2 hours. I expect you to have this cleared up by then, and do try to keep the sirens to a minimum. It's very gauche." Hamish felt a surge of cold, quiet rage, but he kept it buried deep. He knew that reacting would only give St. John the upper hand. Instead, he pulled out his notebook, the one with the frayed edges and the grocery list on the back, and began to write. He wrote about the pasty, the silver wrapper, and the way the wind was beginning to pick up, carrying the scent of snow and wood smoke. The murder of a local eccentric on the grounds of a wealthy outsider was exactly the sort of thing that would bring the Strathbane police down like a cloud of midges. Within an hour, the quiet lanes of Lochdubh would be filled with the scream of sirens and the aggressive, red-faced demands of DCI Blair. Hamish looked at Rory one last time. The old man had been a nuisance, a terrible musician, and a bit of a thief when it came to unattended sandwiches. But he had been a part of the village. He had been a thread in the fabric of the place, and someone had just pulled that thread with a violent, mocking hand. Hamish's day of avoiding work was officially over. He wouldn't be eating lobster tonight. He'd be eating the bitter bread of a formal investigation, sidelined by his superiors and insulted by the newcomers. But as he stood there in the dying light, he knew something that St. John and the approaching police didn't. He knew that Rory had been terrified of Cornish pasties. The old man had claimed they were a sign of the apocalypse. To kill him with one was a very specific, very cruel piece of knowledge. Someone in this village knew Rory's secrets, and they had used them to turn his death into a punchline. "Aye, Lugs," Hamish said, tucking his notebook into his pocket as the first faint wail of a distant siren reached his ears. "The circus is coming to town. We'd best get ready to play the clowns, or they'll never let us find the truth." He straightened his cap and prepared his most vacant, helpful expression. The useless peasant was about to go on duty, and he had a feeling that the arrogant Mr. St. John was going to find out that Highland justice didn't care much for the price of a Porsche or the convenience of a dinner party. The snow began to fall then, fine and white, slowly covering the blue face of the wandering piper and the yellow crust of the pasty, as if the Highlands themselves were trying to hide the shame of what had been done in the dark. The sirens did not so much arrive as they did assault the quiet air of Lochdubh, a discordant shriek that sent a parliament of rooks exploding from the ancient oaks surrounding the Drumnadrochit estate. Within minutes, the manicured gravel of the driveway was being churned into a grey slush by the tyres of 3 white and blue patrol cars and a black sedan that looked as though it had been driven through a peat bog. Hamish stood by the stone fountain, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his wax jacket, looking for all the world like a man who was struggling to count his own fingers. Luggs sat beside him, his ears flattened against the cacophony, his eyes fixed on the black sedan with a look of profound canine disapproval. The sedan's door flew open with such violence that it nearly hit a lion-shaped topiary. Out stepped Detective Chief Inspector Blair. He was a man whose physical presence was defined by a neck that seemed to have been swallowed by his shoulders and a face that remained a permanent, angry shade of beetroot. Blair didn't walk, he stomped, his heavy brogues crushing the fine white snow and the delicate grass with equal disregard. Behind him trailed Detective Sergeant Anderson, a man who had long ago perfected the art of looking like he was apologizing for his superior's existence. "Macbeth!" Blair roared, his voice echoing off the library wing, and causing Barnaby St. John to pull his head back, inside the window, with a look of startled distaste. "I might have known. A body drops in the Highlands. Who do I find standing over it? The village idiot with his mongrel dog. What have you done to the crime scene, you great lummox? Have you trampled every piece of evidence between here and the harbour?" Hamish assumed an expression of wide-eyed, vacant helpfulness. He adjusted his cap, allowing it to sit at a particularly jaunty, unintelligent angle. "Och, no, Inspector. I've been standing right here, keeping the wind off poor Rory. I thought perhaps the cold might be bad for the forensics, you see." Blair marched up to the fountain and stared down at the wandering piper. His eyes bulged as they settled on the Cornish pasty protruding from the blowpipe. For a moment the DCI was actually silent, his mouth working like a landed fish as he processed the sheer absurdity of the sight. Then he let out a sound that was half laugh and half snarl. "A pasty? You're telling me someone murdered a piper with a bit of pastry?" Blair turned on Hamish, his face darkening to a shade of bruised plum. "Is this some kind of local joke, Macbeth? Did you put that there for a laugh? Because if you did, I'll have your badge and your pension before the sun goes down. It was there when I found him, sir," Hamish said softly, his voice a model of humble sincerity. "And there's a chocolate wrapper just there in the heather. An expensive one, I think, not the kind you'd find at the village shop." Blair didn't even look where Hamish was pointing. He waved dismissively, almost hitting Anderson in the nose. "Chocolate wrappers? Pasties? I haven't got time for your nursery rhymes, Macbeth. It's obvious what happened here. This old vagrant was trespassing, looking for a place to sleep or something to steal. He probably choked on his own lunch while trying to play those infernal pipes. It's an accidental death, plain and simple. Or perhaps a heart attack brought on by a fit of coughing. Either way, it's not a murder until I say it's a murder." "But the pasty, sir," Hamish persisted, his tone deceptively hesitant. Rory had a terrible phobia of Cornish pasties. He called them the yellow-crusted devil's work. He wouldn't have been eating one, let alone sticking it in his pipes. And look at his pockets, Inspector. They've been turned out, yet his money is still on the ground. Blair stepped into Hamish's personal space, the scent of stale tobacco and peppermint breath washing over the constable. "Listen to me, you Highland plod. I've been a detective since you were in short trousers. I don't need a lesson in criminology from a man who spends his days poaching salmon and his nights talking to a dog. If the pockets are out, it was a botched robbery by another vagrant. If the pasty is there, it's because he was a lunatic. Case closed." He turned to Anderson, barking orders with the speed of a machine gun. "Anderson, get the photographer over here, then get the body bagged and moved. I want to speak to the owner of this pile. St. John, isn't it? A man of influence. I won't have him inconvenienced by a protracted investigation into a dead tramp." "But, sir," Anderson ventured timidly, "shouldn't we check the house? If Rory was trespassing—" "I'll handle the house," Blair screamed. "You handle the meat wagon. And you, Macbeth, get out of my sight. Go and direct traffic or whatever it is you do when you aren't being a nuisance. I don't want to see you or that flea-bitten carpet on legs anywhere near this estate for the rest of the day. Do I make myself clear?" Hamish nodded slowly, his face a mask of wounded pride and simple-minded obedience. "Very clear, Inspector. I'll just go and check the road for ice, then. Very important for the safety of the public." He whistled for lugs and began to walk away, his head bowed as if in shame. To any of the officers watching, he looked like a beaten man, sidelined and insulted by the superior intellect from the city. But as soon as he reached the shadow of the great stone gateposts, his gait changed. The slumped shoulders straightened, and the vacant look in his eyes sharpened into a keen, predatory focus. He knew Blair was making a catastrophic mistake, one born of arrogance and a desperate desire to please the wealthy St. John. Rory hadn't choked, and he hadn't been robbed by a passer-by. The placement of the pasty was a signature, a mocking tribute to a very specific fear. And the chocolate wrapper. Hamish had seen those before. They were part of a luxury hamper he had seen being delivered to the hotel only 2 days ago, destined for a guest who liked the finer things in life. "He wants us out of the way, Lugs," Hamish whispered, as they reached the narrow coastal road. The snow was falling more heavily now, a white shroud that was rapidly erasing the footprints of the police. "And that suits us just fine. Blair will spend the next 2 hours drinking St. John's expensive whiskey and filling out the wrong forms. That gives us exactly 2 hours to find out who knew Rory well enough to know about the pasties, and who has a taste for silver-wrapped chocolates." He looked back at the manor house, where the flashing blue lights were already beginning to feel like an intrusion on the ancient cold mystery of the glen. Blair saw a vagrant and a snack. Hamish saw a village secret that had finally turned lethal. He headed toward the Lochdubh hotel, his mind already sifting through the gossip he had heard over the last week. Rory had been seen talking to the new barmaid, a girl with eyes far too sharp for a quiet Highland pub. He had also been seen arguing with the minister's wife about a missing silver spoon. "The formal police will look at the DNA and the fingerprints," Hamish murmured, pulling his collar up against the wind. "But we'll look at the tea and the scones, Lugs. People will tell you anything if they think you're too stupid to understand the answer." He headed for the hotel's back entrance, his hunger for justice finally outweighing his hunger for lobster. The wandering piper was dead, and the lazy policeman was finally on the trail, moving with a quiet, lethal grace that DCI Blair would never even notice until the trap was already sprung. The game was afoot, but in Lochdubh it was played with scones and whispers, not sirens and shouting. The heavy oak door of the Lochdubh hotel creaked open, admitting a gust of freezing Highland air, and a very wet, very contemplative police constable. Hamish shook himself like a heron, droplets of sleet flying from his waxed jacket and onto the polished floorboards of the hallway. The hotel was the central nervous system of the village's social life, especially during a storm, and today it hummed with an unusual frantic energy. The ping of the bell at the front desk was constant, and the low murmur of voices from the residents' lounge suggested that news of old Rory's demise had already travelled through the mist with the speed of a radio wave. Hamish didn't head for the lounge where the gentlefolk sat. He steered himself toward the warmth of the kitchen, Lugs trotting behind him with a proprietary air. Mrs. Emma Jane, the proprietor, was standing over a massive iron pot of Scotch broth, her face flushed from the steam and the sheer effort of keeping the hotel running while the village descended into chaos. She looked up as Hamish slumped into a wooden chair by the range, his boots steaming as they met the heat. Without a word, she reached for a thick ceramic mug and poured him a coffee that was dark enough to have its own gravitational pull. "I suppose you've come to mooch a bit of gossip along with that coffee, Hamish Macbeth," she said, though her eyes were not unkind. She slid a plate containing 2 heavily buttered scones toward him. "The whole village is talking. They say Rory was found dead on that Englishman's estate, and that Blair is up there now, shouting at the topiary and making a nuisance of himself." Hamish took a long, appreciative sip of the coffee, feeling the life return to his frozen limbs. He assumed his most vacant, slightly confused expression, the one that made people feel they were doing a charitable deed by explaining things to him. "It's a sad business, Mrs. Emma Jane. Truly sad. A man like Rory, surviving 80 winters just to go out like that. And the inspector, well, he's a very busy man. He doesn't have much time for the details of a Highland life. He thinks Rory just had a bit of a tumble." "A tumble?" Mrs. Emma Jane snorted, wiping her hands on her apron. Rory knew every inch of that estate. He was poaching salmon there before Barnaby St. John was even a glimmer in his father's eye. He wouldn't just tumble. "And what's this I hear about a pasty? Nellie from the post office says he was found with a Cornish pasty. The man hated them. He used to say they were a foreign invasion wrapped in yellow dough." Hamish nodded slowly, his mind working behind the mask of his deceptive lethargy. "Aye, it's a strange detail, almost like someone wanted to have a laugh at his expense. Tell me, Mrs. Emma Jane, have you had many guests lately with a taste for luxury? Specifically, someone who might be fond of those silver-wrapped chocolates. The ones that come in the fancy blue boxes from the city." The proprietor's expression sharpened. She leaned over the table, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "We had a hamper delivered for room 4, Mrs. Penelope Vane. She's one of those wealthy interior consultants St. John brought up from London to redo the manor. She's been staying here because she says the estate is too draughty for human habitation. A very sharp woman, Hamish. Eyes like a hawk and a tongue that could clip a hedge. She was arguing with Rory in the lobby only yesterday." "Arguing?" Hamish asked, picking up a scone and studying it as if it were a complex piece of evidence. What could an interior consultant have to say to a wandering piper? "Something about a family heirloom," Emma Jane replied. "I caught only snippets, mind you. Something about a brooch that Rory had found while he was supposed to be clearing the old stables at the manor. She called him a thief, and he called her a Sassenach harpy. It wasn't pretty. She's in the lounge now, nursing a gin and tonic and complaining about the lack of central heating in the village." Hamish thanked her with a nod and made his way toward the lounge, his gait slow and seemingly aimless. He paused by the door, observing the room before entering. It was a cosy space, filled with the scent of wood smoke and old leather. In a corner armchair, looking entirely out of place in her silk blouse and tailored trousers, sat Mrs. Penelope Vane. She was indeed sharp-featured, with perfectly manicured nails that drummed a restless rhythm on the arm of her chair. On the table beside her was a small blue box of chocolates, the silver wrappers glinting in the firelight. Hamish wandered into the room, looking like a lost sheep in search of a fold. He approached the fire, rubbing his hands together. "A terrible day to be out, ma'am. The snow's coming down thick now." Mrs. Vane looked up, her gaze raking over his dishevelled appearance with naked contempt. "I suppose you're the local constable. Mr. St. John mentioned there was a representative of the law in the vicinity, though I must say the standards in the Highlands are remarkably relaxed." "Oh, we do our best, ma'am," Hamish said, giving her a wide, simple smile. "It's a quiet place, usually. Not like London, I imagine. But this business with the piper, it's got everyone in a stir. Poor Rory. He was a character, for sure." "He was a nuisance," she snapped, reaching for a chocolate and deftly peeling back the silver foil. She popped it into her mouth, her eyes fixed on the fire. "He was a common thief masquerading as a colourful local. He had something of mine, something quite valuable, and he had the audacity to suggest I should pay him to return it." "A brooch, was it?" Hamish asked innocently. Mrs. Vane froze, the chocolate melting on her tongue. She turned her head slowly to look at him, her eyes narrowing. "How did you know that? Has that woman in the kitchen been eavesdropping again?" "Gossip is the only thing that grows well in Lochdubh, ma'am," Hamish said, shuffling his feet. "But the inspector, DCI Blair, he doesn't listen to gossip. He thinks Rory just had a heart attack. He's closing the case, really. He's quite certain there's nothing to worry about." A look of profound relief flickered across Mrs. Vane's face, so brief that a less observant man would have missed it. She settled back into her chair, her posture relaxing. "Well, that is the most sensible thing I've heard since I arrived in this wilderness. It was an unfortunate accident, clearly. The man was ancient and clearly unwell." "Aye, likely so," Hamish murmured, his eyes lingering on the silver wrappers in the crystal dish on her table. "Though I wonder, he was found with a pasty in his pipes. A Cornish one. It's the strangest thing. I don't suppose you've seen anyone around with a supply of those? Mr. St. John, perhaps?" "Barnaby keeps a freezer full of them," she said dismissively. "He's obsessed with them. I think they're authentic. He was handing them out to the workmen last week like he was some sort of feudal lord. Now, if you'll excuse me, Constable, I have a lot of work to do. This village is exhausting." Hamish nodded, backed out of the room with another humble apology, and stepped back into the hallway. The lazy policeman was gone the moment the door closed behind him. He had learned two vital things. Penelope Vane had a motive, a stolen heirloom, and she had access to the silver-wrapped chocolates found at the scene. Furthermore, Barnaby St. John provided the murder weapon, albeit a pastry-based one. He didn't believe for a second that Rory had died of natural causes. The placement of the pasty was too deliberate, a cruel joke played by someone who knew Rory's specific, eccentric fears. It required a certain level of intimacy with the village's law, something a London consultant shouldn't possess. Unless, of course, she wasn't the only one with a grievance. He headed for the front door, his mind already moving toward his next mooching stop, the manse. If there was a family heirloom involved, the minister would know the history of it. And as Hamish stepped back into the snow, he saw Priscilla Halberton Smythe's sleek green Rover pulling into the hotel drive. The romantic complication had arrived, and in Lochdubh, That usually meant the investigation was about to get much more complicated and much more dangerous. The sleek green Rover came to a halt with a graceful crunch of gravel, its headlamps cutting through the swirling white flakes like twin beacons of civilization. Hamish stood by the hotel porch, his red hair dusted with snow and his hands shoved deep into his pockets, looking for all the world like a stray dog waiting for a kind word. Priscilla Halberton Smythe stepped out of the car, looking as elegant as a winter frost in a tailored wool coat and boots that had never seen the inside of a peat bog. She surveyed the scene, the police cars in the distance, the frantic movement in the hotel lobby, and Hamish's forlorn expression, with a cool, intelligent gaze that always made him feel as though his internal monologue was being broadcast on a loudspeaker. "You look particularly bedraggled today, Hamish," she said, her voice a melodious contrast to the biting wind. "I take it the discovery at the Drumnadrochit estate has reached your ears. The village is already whispering that a man who looks like an angry beetroot has sidelined you. Inspector Blair is a man of great energy, Priscilla," Hamish replied, assuming his mask of mild-mannered stupidity. "He has the situation well in hand, or so he tells me. He thinks poor Rory simply had a disagreement with a bit of pastry and a weak heart. I'm just here to ensure the guests aren't overly distressed by the excitement." Priscilla walked toward him, her perfume, something subtle and expensive that didn't belong in a village that smelled of wet wool and wood smoke, drifting past him. "Don't play the fool with me, Hamish Macbeth. I saw you looking at those silver chocolates in the lounge through the window. And I know that look in your eye. You've found something that doesn't fit into Blair's neat little box of accidental death, haven't you?" Hamish sighed, the deceptive lethargy slipping just an inch. He gestured toward the hotel bar, which was starting to fill with the evening crowd. "It's a complicated business, Priscilla. There's a Mrs. Penelope Vane in there who's lost a brooch and found a sudden interest in Highland mortality. And there's the matter of Barnaby St. John's freezer. It's full of the very thing that ended up in Rory's blowpipe." "The pasty," Priscilla murmured, her eyes narrowing. "It's a nasty, mocking touch. But you're missing something, Hamish. You always focus on the villagers and the newcomers, but you forget the social dynamics of the upper class. Barnaby St. John isn't just an arrogant man with a Porsche. He's a man who is desperately trying to hide the fact that he's nearly bankrupt. That culture he's bringing to the north is a desperate attempt to lure investors into a scheme to turn the estate into a high-end wellness retreat." Hamish tilted his head, his interest genuinely piqued. "Bankrupt? He doesn't drive like a man who's worried about his petrol money. It's all theatre," Priscilla continued, leaning against the stone pillar of the porch. "My father had dinner with him last week. St. John was boasting about a collection of Jacobite gold that was supposedly hidden in the manor's secret cellars. He claimed he'd found a map. But everyone knows the Drumnadrochit gold is a myth, a story told to tourists to make the glen seem more romantic. Old Rory didn't think it was a myth," Hamish said softly, his mind clicking into place. He spent half his life poking around those old ruins. If St. John was looking for gold to save his skin, and Rory was in the way, or if Rory had actually found something, the tension between them would be more than just a noise complaint about the pipes. Priscilla nodded. "And then there's Penelope Vane. She isn't just an interior consultant, Hamish. She's an appraiser, a specialist in 18th century Scottish jewellery. If a brooch was found in the stables, it wasn't just a family heirloom. It was likely a piece of the very treasure St. John is banking on to save his reputation. So we have a man who needs a fortune, a woman who knows how to value it, and a piper who knows where the bodies and the gold were buried," Hamish mused. He looked at Priscilla, appreciative of the way she always managed to provide the missing piece of the social puzzle. "But why the pasty? Why the humiliation?" "Because Barnaby St. John is a bully," Priscilla said simply. "He doesn't just want to win, he wants to crush his opposition. He's the type of man who would think it's hilarious to kill a man with the very thing he feared most. It's a signature of contempt." Hamish rubbed his chin, his hazel eyes darkening. "Aye, it fits the character. But Blair won't hear a word. He's currently sharing a single malt with St. John and laughing about the local colour. If I try to suggest the billionaire is a murderer, Blair will have me transferred to a traffic island in Glasgow before I can say scone. Then don't suggest it to Blair, Priscilla said, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. Investigate the woman. Penelope Vane is the weak link. She's frightened, Hamish. I saw her hand shaking when she reached for her gin. She isn't a killer, but she's an accomplice to something she didn't sign up for. She's worried that her professional reputation will be ruined if she's linked to a death, accidental or otherwise. Hamish looked back into the hotel lounge, where Mrs. Vane was still staring into the fire. The romantic complication had once again served as the perfect sounding board. Priscilla's insights into the desperation of the wealthy provided a motive that Rory's poaching never could. It wasn't about a stolen spoon, it was about surviving a fortune. "Thank you, Priscilla," Hamish said, his voice returning to its soft, deceptive Highland lilt. "You've given me a lot to think about. I think I'll go and have another mooch around the kitchen." Mrs. Emma Jane mentioned that the staff at the manor have been complaining about the grocery bills lately. If St. John is as broke as you say, he'll be cutting corners on more than just the heating. "Be careful, Hamish," Priscilla warned, her tone turning uncharacteristically serious. "A man with his back to the wall is far more dangerous than an arrogant man with a Porsche. And the snow is getting worse. If you get stuck out on those moors, even Lugs won't be able to find you." "Och, I'll be fine," Hamish said, patting Lugs's head. "I have a thick coat and a thicker skull, or so the inspector says. And I have a feeling that Rory's bagpipes have one last song to play before this night is over." As Priscilla drove away, her taillights disappearing into the white veil of the storm, Hamish didn't return to the warmth of the fire. He stood in the cold, listening to the wind. He thought about the silver chocolate wrappers, the bankruptcy of a Sassenach, and the hidden gold of the Highlands. The investigation was unfolding not through forensics, but through the realization that everyone was hiding something, some out of greed, some out of fear, and some out of a desperate need to belong. He headed for the manse, moving with a quiet, purposeful gait. He needed to talk to the minister about the history of the Drumnadroshit gold. If Rory had found something, the old man would have bragged about it to the one person who was paid to listen to his sins. And as the snow began to pile up against the stone walls of Lochdubh, Hamish Macbeth prepared to play the most dangerous game of his career, the one where he stayed quiet and let the guilty speak for him. The wind howled with a renewed ferocity as Hamish trudged toward the manse, the snow now deep enough to pull at his shins. Lugs followed in his master's wake, his ears flattened against the freezing gale. The minister's house was a sturdy, uncompromising structure that looked as though it had been built to withstand the day of judgment. And inside, the Reverend Mr. Wellington was nursing a glass of sherry by a fire that was nearly as formidable as his sermons. He looked up as Hamish entered, the constable's hair a wild thicket of damp ginger, and his face pale with the cold. The minister didn't need to ask why Hamish was there. In Lochdubh, a death on the estate was like a crack in the foundation of a house. Everyone felt the shudder. "You've come about Rory," Wellington said, gesturing toward the hearth, a sad end for a man who, despite his many flaws, was as much a part of this glen as the granite. "Blair has been here, you know. He spent 10 minutes shouting about vagrancy and 5 minutes drinking my best sherry before declaring it a settled matter of natural causes. He's convinced the old man simply expired from the sheer effort of being a nuisance." Hamish took a seat, the steam beginning to rise from his trousers as the heat hit them. He assumed his most vacant expression, the one he used when he wanted people to fill the silence with their own thoughts. "Aye, the inspector is a man of great certainty. But I was wondering, Minister, Rory was a man who talked a lot when he had a dream in him. Did he ever mention finding anything, something old perhaps, something that didn't belong to him?" The minister sighed, staring into the flames. "He came to me a week ago. He was in a state of great excitement, and even greater fear. He said he'd found a glint in the dark near the old stables at Drumnadroshit. He showed me a brooch, Hamish. It was a beautiful thing, silver and citrine, clearly 18th century. He thought it was part of the lost Jacobite gold. I told him to take it to the authorities, but he was terrified that St. John would claim it as his own. Rory felt it belonged to the people of the Glen, not to a man who'd bought the land with London money. "And did anyone else see this brooch?" Hamish asked, his voice low and steady. "Only the new barmaid at the hotel, I believe, a girl named Mary." Rory had a soft spot for her, and I fear he bragged about his discovery to impress her. "She's a clever girl, Mary. Perhaps too clever for a quiet place like this." Hamish thanked the minister and stepped back out into the night, his mind already shifting the pieces of the puzzle. He had a motive now, the Jacobite gold, and a witness who had likely shared Rory's secret with the wrong people. But as he walked back toward the village, he saw the flashing lights of a patrol car outside the hotel. Blair was there, and he looked even more agitated than before. He was dragging a young man out of the hotel's staff quarters, a local lad named Archie who worked as a gardener at the manor. Archie was weeping, his face a mask of terror as Blair shook him by the collar. "I found it!" Blair roared, spotting Hamish in the gloom. "While you were out playing at being a mystic, Macbeth, I did some real police work. I found the stolen property. This young thug had Rory's silver flask hidden in his mattress. It's clear as day. He killed the old man for the spoils and tried to make it look like an accident. He was the one Rory was arguing with this morning. He's going to Strathbane tonight, and I'm going to make sure he stays there." Archie looked at Hamish, his eyes pleading. "I didn't do it, Hamish. I found the flask in the grass near the fountain. I only took it because I thought Rory wouldn't be needing it anymore. I didn't kill him, I swear." Blair let out a bark of laughter. "Found it in the grass? A likely story. You're a thief and a murderer, boy. Anderson, get the handcuffs. We've got our man." Hamish watched as the boy was bundled into the back of the car. To any outsider, the case was indeed closed. The suspect had the victim's property, he had the opportunity, and he was a local with a history of petty mischief. But Hamish's eyes were fixed on the boy's feet. Archie was wearing a pair of heavy, mud-caked Wellington boots. The footprints Hamish had seen by the fountain, the ones near the chocolate wrapper, hadn't been from Wellingtons. They had been the narrow, sharp-edged prints of a dress shoe, the kind worn by a man who wouldn't be caught dead in rubber boots. "Wait, Inspector," Hamish said, his voice hesitant and deceptively weak. "There's something wrong. Look at the boy's boots. They're too wide. The prints near the body were narrow. And there's the cat thing." Blair turned, his face a terrifying shade of crimson. "The cat? What the devil are you talking about, Macbeth? Have you finally lost the few wits you were born with?" "Mr. St. John's cat," Hamish continued, ignoring the insult, "a Persian, very pampered. It was sitting on the library windowsill when I arrived. It had a bit of yellow grease on its whiskers, the kind of grease you'd find on a Cornish pasty. But Archie here hates cats. He's allergic. He wouldn't have gone near the library window, and he certainly wouldn't have been feeding the cat pasties." "You're insane!" Blair screamed. "I've got a confession in the making and a suspect with the loot, and you're talking about cat whiskers. Get out of my way. I'm taking this boy to Strathbane, and I'm writing a report that will mention your interference as a deliberate obstruction of justice." The car roared, leaving Hamish standing in the snow again. He knew Blair was about to arrest an innocent boy, blinded by the easy win and the desire to please St. John. But the cat whiskers had confirmed what Hamish had suspected. The pasty hadn't come from the gardener's lunchbox. It had come from the house, and it had been handled by someone who was comfortable near the library window. He walked back to the hotel, his gait purposeful now. He needed to find Mary, the barmaid. If Rory had told her about the brooch, and she had told someone else, she was the bridge between the wandering piper and his killer. He found her in the staff corridor, her bags packed and her coat on. She looked startled to see him, her eyes darting toward the exit. "Going somewhere, Mary?" Hamish asked, his voice soft but carrying an unmistakable edge of authority. I can't stay here, Mr. Macbeth," she stammered. "Not with all this death and the police everywhere. It's not what I signed up for." "Did you tell Barnaby St. John about the brooch, Mary?" Hamish asked, stepping into her path. "Or was it Mrs. Vane? Did they promise you a cut of the gold if you helped them find out where Rory was hiding the rest of it?" Mary's face went deathly pale. She looked at the floor, her hands trembling. He was so loud, Mr. Macbeth. Mr. St. John. He said Rory was a thief, and the brooch belonged to the estate. He said he just wanted to talk to him. I didn't know he'd hurt him. And the pasty? Hamish asked. He thought it was a joke, she whispered, a tear tracing a path through the heavy makeup on her cheek. He said Rory was a pasty-faced peasant, and that he'd give him a taste of his own medicine. He made me get it from the freezer. He was laughing, Mr. Macbeth. Even when Rory stopped moving, he was still laughing. Hamish felt a cold, hard knot of anger in his chest. St. John hadn't just killed the old man, he had turned the act into a piece of theatre for his own amusement, and he had used a young boy's opportunistic theft of a flask to cover his tracks, knowing Blair would be too lazy to look further. But Mary's testimony was the word of a frightened girl against a billionaire and his expensive lawyers. He needed more than just her confession. He needed a trap that would make St. John reveal his own hand. "Stay here, Mary," Hamish said. "Don't leave the village. If you do, Blair will find you, and he won't be as patient as I am. I'm going to give Mr. St. John a taste of his own Highland culture." He headed back toward the manor, the snow now a blinding white wall. He knew exactly what he had to do. He wasn't going to go to Blair with the truth. The DCI would only find a way to twist it to his own glory or dismiss it entirely. No, Hamish was going to use the one thing St. John couldn't resist, his own greed and his contempt for the stupid locals. He reached for the bagpipes he'd recovered from the fountain, the drone still wheezing in the wind. Rory's last song wasn't finished yet, and before the night was over, Barnaby St. John was going to find out that in Lochdubh, the piper always gets paid. The trap was set, and the lazy policeman was about to lead the arrogant Sassenach straight into the jaws of a Highland justice that didn't care for Porsches or Cornish pasties. The heavy, wet snow continued to fall, transforming the landscape of Lochdubh into a featureless white void that seemed to swallow the very light of the stars. Hamish Macbeth stood at the edge of the Drumnadrochit estate, the battered set of Rory's bagpipes tucked under his arm like a wounded bird. He looked up at the manor house, where the golden glow from the library windows suggested a world of warmth, brandy, and a profound, arrogant security. Barnaby St. John would be sitting there now, congratulating himself on his narrow escape and the convenient arrest of young Archie. To a man like St. John, the life of a wandering piper and the future of a local gardener were merely acceptable losses in the preservation of his own fragile empire. He was a man who believed that the world was divided into the predators and the prey, and he had spent the afternoon convinced that the red-faced Inspector Blair was his most useful tool. Hamish adjusted his cap, feeling the weight of the moment. He knew that the hidden motive Priscilla had hinted at, the desperate bankruptcy disguised by Highland theatre, was the key to everything. St. John hadn't killed Rory out of a sudden fit of rage. He had killed him because the old man possessed the one thing that could truly save the estate, the location of the rest of the Jacobite gold. The citrine brooch had been the proof, and the Cornish pasty had been the weapon of a bully who wanted to terrorize his victim into submission. St. John had underestimated the old man's stubbornness, and Rory's heart had simply given out under the strain of the humiliation. Now the billionaire was left with a dead body, a missing treasure, and a growing desperation that Hamish intended to exploit. He whistled softly for Lugs, who emerged from the shadows of a nearby gorse bush, his fur matted with ice, but his eyes as sharp as ever. "Stay close, Lugs. We're going to give the master of the house a little something to think about before he goes to bed." Hamish didn't head for the front door, nor did he attempt to sneak back to the fountain. Instead, he moved toward the old stables, the very place where Rory had found the brooch. He knew that St. John would be watching that area with the intensity of a hawk, waiting for any sign that the rest of the treasure had been unearthed. As he walked, Hamish pulled a small silver foil wrapper from his pocket, the one he had found in the heather but which he had actually pocketed before Blair could dismiss it. He also pulled out a small, heavy stone he had picked up from the harbour wall. He wrapped the stone in silver foil, making it look for all the world like one of Mrs. Vane's luxury chocolates, or perhaps something much more valuable. He tossed the treasure onto the freshly shoveled path leading to the stables, right where the light from the library would catch the glint of the foil as the moon broke through the clouds. Then he did something that would have made Blair scream with rage. He began to play the bagpipes. Hamish was no master of the instrument, few in the Highlands were, but he knew enough to coax a low, mournful drone from the pipes. In the silence of the snowy night, the sound was haunting, a ghostly echo of the wandering piper who had been silenced so cruelly. The notes were discordant and strange, carried on the wind like a voice from the grave. He stood in the shadow of a great yew tree, invisible in his dark waxed jacket, and let the pipes wail their sorrowful tune. Inside the library, a shadow moved across the window. The curtain was pulled back, and the silhouette of Barnaby St. John appeared, frozen in a posture of sudden, visceral fear. To a man with a guilty conscience, the sound of Rory's pipes returning to the scene of the crime must have felt like a physical blow. St. John stood there for a long moment, staring into the white darkness. Then his gaze dropped to the path, where the silver foil glinted in the pale light. Hamish watched through the branches, his breath hitching in the cold. He saw St. John turn away from the window, and a moment later the side door of the manor flew open. The billionaire stepped out, not in his cashmere coat this time, but in a silk dressing gown and a pair of velvet slippers that were instantly ruined by the slush. He was carrying a heavy flashlight, its beam cutting through the snow like a searchlight. He didn't head for the village, and he didn't call for the police. He moved straight for the glint of silver on the path. "Just a little further, Mr. St. John," Hamish whispered to himself. He stopped playing the pipes, letting the silence return with a heavy, suffocating weight. St. John reached the place and fell to his knees, his hands trembling as he reached for the silver-wrapped stone. He tore at the foil with a frantic, animalistic greed, his breath coming in ragged gasps. When the grey harbour stone fell into the snow, his face went from a mask of hope to a mask of pure, murderous fury. He looked around, the beam of his flashlight dancing wildly over the topiary. "Who's there?" St. John screamed, his voice cracking with a mixture of rage and terror. "Is that you, Macbeth? You pathetic, red-haired peasant. I know you're out there. I've already settled with the police. You can't touch me." Hamish stepped out from the shadow of the yew tree, the bagpipe still tucked under his arm. He looked remarkably calm, his face illuminated by the reflected glow of the snow. "It's a cold night for a walk in your slippers, Mr. St. John. I was just worried that the music might be disturbing your dinner party. I thought I'd come and check on you." St. John scrambled to his feet, his eyes wild. "The music? That wasn't music, it was a ghost. You're trying to blackmail me, aren't you? You think you can use that old man's death to get a piece of what's mine? Well, you're wrong. Blair has the killer. That boy is halfway to Strathbane by now." "Archie didn't kill anyone, sir," Hamish said, his voice as soft as the falling snow, and he didn't have the chocolate wrappers in his pocket, nor did he have a freezer full of Cornish pasties. You see, the thing about Highland justice is that it doesn't always need a badge, it just needs a witness, and Mary has a very long memory when it comes to the things she sees in the manor kitchen. St. John let out a low, guttural growl. He dropped the flashlight and lunged at Hamish, his hands reaching for the constable's throat. He wasn't a large man, but he was possessed by the desperate strength of a cornered animal. Hamish, however, was far more physically capable than his lazy reputation suggested. He stepped to the side with the grace of a stag, letting St. John's momentum carry him forward into the stone basin of the dry fountain. The billionaire hit the stone with a sickening thud, the same fountain where Rory had taken his final breath. He slumped over the edge, gasping for air, looking exactly like the man he had mocked so crudely only hours before. Hamish stood over him, not with anger, but with a weary, sceptical pity. "The trap wasn't the stone, Mr. St. John," Hamish said, looking down at the broken man. "The trap was your own greed." The sirens of the regional investigative team grew into a deafening roar, their rhythmic flashes of blue and red turning the white expanse of the Drumnadrochit estate into a surreal, pulsating landscape. Barnaby St. John remained slumped against the fountain, his velvet slippers now entirely encased in a grey, icy slush that seemed to be claiming him inch by inch. Hamish Macbeth stood perfectly still, the citrine brooch resting in the palm of his hand like a drop of frozen sunlight. He looked at the ancient silverwork, then at Priscilla, whose presence provided the necessary social weight to ensure that the events of the night would not be dismissed as the ramblings of a useless peasant. "The gold is where it belongs, Priscilla," Hamish said, his voice barely audible over the wind. "In the heart of the glen. Rory knew that if it were dug up, it would only bring the likes of St. John here to tear the place apart. He only took this one piece to prove he wasn't a liar, but I think he regretted it the moment he touched it. The Highlands have a way of keeping their secrets, and they don't take kindly to those who try to trade them for a Porsche and a bit of London vanity." The first of the regional cars skidded to a halt, and a group of officers, who looked far more professional and far less agitated than Blair's crew, stepped out. Among them was the Assistant Chief Constable, a man who had little patience for the dramatic outbursts of subordinates. At the same time, Blair's own black sedan screeched back onto the gravel, the DCI leaping out with a face that was now a terrifying shade of midnight purple. He had clearly been intercepted by the regional team and told that the very man he had dismissed as a nuisance had just reopened his closed case. "Macbeth!" Blair screamed, his voice cracking like a whip. "What is the meaning of this? I had the suspect in the cells. I had a motive. You've gone behind my back to the fiscal, you treacherous red-haired—" Now, Inspector," the Assistant Chief Constable interrupted, his voice like cold iron. "It seems Constable Macbeth has recovered the murder weapon, the pasty, I believe, and secured a full witness statement from Mrs. Vane and the hotel staff. He also has the stolen national heritage in his hand. While you were busy bullying a gardener, Macbeth was actually doing a cop's job. I suggest you stand back and let the forensics team do their job." Blair looked like he might have an apoplectic fit on the spot. He stared at the brooch, then at the broken, sobbing figure of Barnaby St. John, and finally at Hamish. The realization that he had been played, and played beautifully, began to sink in. He had been lured into a false sense of security, while Hamish quietly dismantled the entire facade of St. John's life. Hamish assumed his most vacant, slightly confused expression. He adjusted his cap and looked at Blair with a gaze of pure bovine innocence. "I was just trying to help, sir." "I thought you'd be pleased. You see, Mr. St. John here was so overcome with guilt that he just couldn't stop talking once he heard the pipes. I think he wanted to make a full confession to a man of your standing, but since you were busy at the station, he had to settle for me and the Assistant Chief." "A confession?" Blair sputtered, his eyes darting toward the regional officers, who were already beginning to read St. John his rights. He confessed to you." "In front of witnesses, sir," Hamish said, gesturing toward Priscilla and the trembling Penelope Vane. "It seems the Jacobite gold was the motive all along. St. John killed Rory to get the location of the hoard, and when he couldn't get it, he tried to make the death look like a prank. It's a very clean result, Inspector, just the sort of thing that looks grand in the annual report." The Assistant Chief Constable turned to Hamish, a flicker of genuine respect in his eyes. "You've done a remarkable job, Macbeth. The recovery of 18th century silver alone is worth a commendation. And to catch a high-profile suspect like St. John, I think a promotion to sergeant in Inverness is the very least we can do for you. We need men with your intuition in the city." Hamish felt a cold lump of dread settle in his stomach. The one thing he feared more than a snowstorm or a hungry stomach was a promotion that would take him away from the hills and the loch. He looked at the Assistant Chief, then at the fuming, humiliated Blair. He knew exactly what he had to do to save his quiet life. "Och, sir, you're far too kind," Hamish said, his voice dripping with humble sincerity. "But I have to be honest. Inspector Blair did most of the heavy lifting. He was the one who spotted the inconsistencies in the gardener's story. He told me to come back here and keep an eye on the estate while he flushed out the truth from the city end. I was just following his brilliant lead. The trap, well, that was the inspector's idea. He told me to play the pipes to unsettle the guilty conscience. I'm just a pair of hands, really. Blair's head snapped up. He looked at Hamish, his eyes widening as he realized the lifeline he was being thrown. If he took the credit for the investigation, he wouldn't be the man who bungled an arrest. He would be the master strategist who had used his subordinate to spring a trap on a billionaire. He would get the headlines, he would get the glory, and most importantly, he would be the one transferred to a high-profile desk in the city, far away from the useless peasants of Lochdubh. That's right, Blair shouted, his voice regaining its blustering confidence. It was a deep cover operation. I had to let Macbeth play the fool to put St. John off his guard. I was in constant radio contact, directing traffic from the station. The pasty, the pipes, it was all part of my psychological profile of the suspect. I'm glad you arrived in time to see the conclusion, sir. The assistant chief constable looked between the two men, a skeptical smile playing on his lips. He was no fool, but he also knew that a successful arrest of a billionaire was a political win that didn't need to be overcomplicated by the truth of who had actually done the thinking. Well, if that's the case, Blair, I expect a full report on my desk by Monday. And I think we'll be seeing a lot more of you in the regional office. We need strategic minds like yours at headquarters. I'll start on it tonight, sir. Blair beamed, already looking like he was measuring curtains for a new, larger office. Hamish stepped back into the shadows, a small, secret smile on his face. He watched as the police began to clear the scene, the lights and the noise finally beginning to recede. St. John was led away in handcuffs, his velvet slippers leaving a final, pathetic trail in the snow. Penelope Vane was taken for questioning, her professional life in tatters, and Blair was busy barking orders at Anderson, his ego inflated to a size that would surely require its own postal code once he reached Inverness. Priscilla walked over to Hamish, her coat dusted with white. "You're a devious man, Hamish Macbeth. You gave him everything, the credit, the glory, and the promotion." "I gave him what he wanted, Priscilla," Hamish said, looking out at the dark waters of the loch. "And he gave me what I wanted. Another winter in Lochdubh, a quiet station, and no one from headquarters bothering me for another 6 months. I think it's a fair trade." "And the brooch?" she asked. "I'll be returning it to the minister," Hamish said. "It belongs to Kirk, and I suspect the lost gold will stay lost for another few centuries. It's better that way. The Highlands have enough ghosts without adding the greed of the living to the pile." He whistled for lugs, and the two of them began the long trek back toward the village. The snow was falling more gently now, a soft white blanket that was already erasing the chaos of the night. Hamish felt a familiar rumble in his stomach. The lobster was gone, and the scones were a distant memory, but he had a tin of stew on the stove and a bed that didn't involve a city apartment. As he walked, he could almost hear the faint, ghostly wheeze of a bagpipe in the wind, a sound of satisfaction from a wandering piper who had finally found his peace. The case was closed, the credit was shifted, and the laziest policeman in the north was finally going home. The blue and red lights of the regional police convoy eventually faded into a rhythmic, distant pulse against the white-cloaked hills, leaving the Drumnadroshit estate to the mercy of the thickening snow and the ancient, heavy silence of the Highlands. Hamish stood by the stone fountain for a long moment, the wind tugging at his ginger hair, which was now damp and flattened under his cap. The adrenaline that had sharpened his movements during the confrontation with St. John was beginning to ebb, replaced by a profound, hollow weariness that reached deep into his bones. He looked down at the stone basin where old Rory had been mocked in his final moments. The billionaire was gone. Blair was already drafting his own heroic narrative in his head, and the village was one character poorer. But as Hamish turned the citrine brooch over in his hand, he knew the hidden motive for the night's violence wasn't just the greed of a bankrupt Sassenach. It was the specific, terrifying reality of what Rory had actually discovered. Priscilla lingered by her rover, her breath blooming in the frozen air. She watched Hamish with a mixture of curiosity and a quiet, aristocratic concern that she rarely allowed the world to see. "You didn't tell them everything, Hamish," she said softly, her voice carrying over the crunch of his boots as he approached her car. "You mentioned the gold was where it belonged, but you have that look in your eye, the one you get when you've found a truth that's too heavy for a police report. What did Rory find in those stables? It wasn't just a single brooch, was it?" Hamish stopped, leaning his long frame against the hood of the car. He looked toward the darkened stables, where the stone was so old it seemed to be sinking back into the earth. "Rory didn't just find a glint in the dark, Priscilla. He found the source. St. John thought he was looking for a chest of coins, something he could carry away and sell to a collector in London to pay off his debts. But Rory was a man of the earth. He knew that the Jacobite gold wasn't just hidden, it was guarded. He told the minister it was a glint, but what he really found was a tomb." Priscilla's eyes widened, the blue of them becoming dark in the moonlight. "A tomb? You mean an actual burial?" "Aye," Hamish murmured, his gaze fixed on the distant mountain peaks. "The old stories say that the men who survived Culloden and brought the French gold into the glen didn't just bury the treasure, they stayed with it. Rory found a hollow beneath the stable floorboards, a dry stone chamber where the last of the guardians had been laid to rest. He didn't just see silver and gold, he saw the bones of men who had died for a cause that St. John couldn't even begin to understand. That's why the old man was so terrified. It wasn't just the theft of the metal that bothered him, it was the desecration. He knew that if St. John found that chamber, he'd have the bones tossed into the loch just to get at the jewellery. And that's why you let Blair take the credit and the promotion, Priscilla realised, her voice a whisper of understanding. If the regional team stayed, if they conducted a full forensic sweep of the grounds to find the missing hoard, they'd uncover the burial site. It would become a tourist attraction, a heritage site, a circus of archaeologists and news crews. The peace of the glen would be gone forever. "Exactly," Hamish said, slipping the brooch back into his pocket. "By making it look like a simple case of a man dying from a prank gone wrong during a business dispute, the estate becomes a crime scene for a week. And then, nothing. St. John will be in prison, the bank will seize the property, and the stables will likely stay locked and neglected for another 50 years. The men in that chamber have waited 2 centuries for a bit of quiet. I didn't see the need to wake them up for the sake of a few more headlines for DCI Blair." He looked at Lugs, who was sniffing at a patch of frozen heather. The dog seemed to agree with the sentiment. In Lochdubh, the past was never truly dead, it was just sleeping beneath the peat, and Hamish Macbeth considered himself the unofficial guardian of that sleep. The wandering piper had died trying to protect that secret, and Hamish felt that the best tribute he could pay to the old man was to ensure the secret stayed kept. "You're a very different kind of policeman, Hamish," Priscilla said, her expression softening into something like genuine affection. She reached into her car and produced a small silver thermos. "Here, it's not a scone, but it's hot coffee with a bit of my father's best brandy in it. You look like you need it more than I do." Hamish took the thermos with a grateful nod, the warmth of the metal seeping into his chilled fingers. He took a long, burning swallow, the brandy sending a jolt of heat through his system. "Thank you, Priscilla. You've been a grand help tonight. Without you as a witness, Blair would have had me in the cells alongside Archie, just for the impudence of being right." "I doubt that," she laughed, climbing back into the driver's seat. "But I'm glad I could be of service. I'll see you in the village, Hamish. Try not to let the minister talk your ear off when you return that brooch. He'll be wanting to say a prayer for Rory, and I suspect he'll want you to stand for it." "I'll do my best to avoid praying, Priscilla. It's the kneeling that gets to my joints in this weather," Hamish quipped, his dry, sceptical humour returning as the rover's engine purred to life. He watched as she drove away, her tail lights 2 red sparks in the white gloom. He was alone now, save for Lugs and the ghosts of the Drumnadroshit estate. He walked back toward the fountain one last time, picking up the harbour stone he had wrapped in foil. He unwrapped it, pocketing the silver paper so as not to leave any Sassenach litter behind, and tossed the stone into the dark water of the loch. He thought about Rory's pipes, still lying in the back of his mind like a mournful refrain. The old man's music had been terrible, his character had been questionable, and his presence had been a nuisance. But he had been a Highlander. He had understood the value of the land in a way Barnaby St. John never could. As Hamish began the long walk back to his station, he felt the first real pangs of hunger. His stomach let out a low, aggressive rumble that rivaled the wind. He had spent the day being insulted, threatened, and frozen, all to solve a crime that the official police didn't even want to admit existed. And his reward? A cold tin of stew, and the knowledge that he'd have to spend the next 3 days filling out the basic logistical support forms that Blair would inevitably leave for him. "Aye, Lugs," Hamish said, his voice echoing in the snowy silence. "The billionaire goes to a cell, the inspector goes to the city, and the gardener goes home to his mother. And what do we get? A wet coat and a long walk." The dog let out a sharp, happy bark, jumping up at Hamish's hand. Lugs didn't care about Jacobite gold or regional promotions. He cared that the shouting had stopped and that they were heading toward a fireplace. Hamish smiled, his hazel eyes crinkling at the corners. The snow was falling in large, soft flakes now, a silent blanket that was rapidly erasing the tire tracks and the footprints of the evening's drama. By tomorrow morning, the estate would look like nothing had happened. The secrets of the Highlands would be safe, buried beneath the white, and PC Hamish Macbeth would be back to his lazy routine, nursing a coffee and watching the tide. It was a good result, he decided, a very good result indeed. He adjusted his cap, whistled a faint, discordant tune that sounded suspiciously like a bagpipe march, and headed for the lights of Lochdubh. The wandering piper was gone, but the song of the glen remained, and for Hamish that was more than enough. The lights of Lochdubh blinked through the swirling white veil like a string of mismatched amber beads, welcoming Hamish back from the cold, high drama of the estate. The walk had been long, the kind of trek that turned a man's thoughts toward the fundamental comforts of life. A dry pair of socks, a crackling hearth, and a pot of tea strong enough to dissolve a silver spoon. Lugs trotted beside him, his fur now a chaotic collection of frozen tufts, but his spirit undampened as he sensed the proximity of the police station. The village was quiet, the residents tucked away in their cottages, likely discussing the sights and sounds of the evening's police activity with the practiced fervour of people who lived for a good scandal. As Hamish reached the narrow lane that led to his home and headquarters, he saw a light still burning in the window of the manse. He sighed, knowing that he couldn't simply crawl into bed without finishing the last piece of business Rory had left behind. He made a slight detour, his boots crunching on the fresh snow that now lay like a thick, downy quilt over the village. The Reverend Mr. Wellington answered the door on the first knock, his face etched with a quiet anxiety that only vanished when he saw the calm, albeit frozen, expression on Hamish's face. "It's over then, Hamish?" the minister asked, ushering him into the hallway. "I saw the regional cars heading south. The word in the village is that Barnaby St. John is in the back of one of them." "He is indeed, Minister," Hamish said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out the citrine brooch. He handed it to the older man, the silver glinting in the soft hallway light. "And this is back where it belongs. I'd be grateful if you'd put it somewhere safe. Rory wanted it to go to Kirk, but I think it's best if it stays out of the public eye for a while. It's got a bit too much blood on it for a display case." The minister took the brooch with a steady hand, his eyes darkening as he looked at the ancient piece. "I'll see to it, Hamish." "And the boy, Archie?" "He'll be home by morning," Hamish replied, his voice a model of weary satisfaction. The inspector realized that Archie's confession wasn't worth much in the face of the truth. "Blair is busy being a hero in the city now, which suits us all just fine. I don't think we'll be seeing much of him in Lochdubh for a long time." "You've done a good thing, Hamish," Wellington said softly. "Rory would have been... well, he wouldn't have been able to say it, but he would have been thankful." Hamish nodded, turned back into the cold, and finally made his way to the station. He unlocked the door, the familiar scent of old paper and wood smoke greeting him like an old friend. Within minutes, he had the stove roaring, the iron kettle beginning to hum its familiar tune. He changed into a dry sweater and thick woolen trousers, feeling the warmth of the room slowly thawing the icy grip of the moors from his limbs. He opened a tin of stew, the smell of beef and gravy filling the small kitchen, and shared a generous portion with Lugs, who devoured it with a speed that suggested he hadn't eaten in a decade. The following morning broke with a crisp, blinding clarity. The snow had stopped, and the Highlands were revealed in a spectacular frozen glory, the peaks of the mountains jagged and white against a sky of pale, crystalline blue. Hamish sat at his small kitchen table, a mug of coffee in his hand and the Morning Post spread out before him. There was a letter from headquarters, likely containing the basic logistical support forms Blair had promised, but it sat unopened. Instead, Hamish was watching the harbour. The village was returning to its normal, slow-paced routine. Mrs. Emma Jane was out sweeping the hotel porch, and Nellie from the post office was pinning a new notice to the board, likely a memorial service for old Rory. The orange Porsche was gone from the manor driveway, seized by the bank along with the rest of St. John's Hollow Empire. The Sassenach intrusion had been purged, leaving the glen to its own devices once more. A familiar figure appeared on the path, Detective Sergeant Anderson, looking remarkably relaxed without the shadow of Blair looming over him. He entered the station, the cold air following him in a sharp gust. "He's done it, Hamish," Anderson said, a rare, genuine grin on his face. "Blair's been promoted. Senior investigative lead at the Inverness Regional Office. He's already requested a new desk overlooking the river. He thinks he's the next Sherlock Holmes. He even mentioned that your local assistance was adequate, in a primitive sort of way." Hamish chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "Oh, that's grand news, Anderson, truly grand. I'm happy for him. It's a busy life, the city. He'll be much better suited to it than the quiet lanes here." "And you?" Anderson asked, leaning against the counter. "The assistant chief was quite impressed with you. You could have had his job, or at least a sergeant's stripes." "I have everything I need right here, Anderson," Hamish said, gesturing toward the loch and the mountains. "I have a roof that doesn't leak too much, a dog that listens to me occasionally, and a village that knows when to leave a man alone. Why would I want to trade that for a view of a river and a mountain of paperwork?" Anderson nodded, knowing better than to argue. He stayed for a cup of coffee, the two men sitting in a comfortable silence that Blair would have found intolerable. They talked about the weather, the price of sheep, and the likelihood of the salmon running early this year. The murder of the wandering piper was already becoming a part of the village's lore, a story to be polished and refined over pints in the hotel bar, but for the two policemen it was a closed chapter. When Anderson finally left, heading back toward the city and his own new responsibilities under a likely more competent superior, Hamish stood at the door and watched the car vanish. He felt a profound sense of peace. The hidden motive, the Jacobite gold, and the pasty-faced killer were secrets he would keep, shared only with the ghosts of the Drumnadroshit stables and the silent peaks of the north. He had protected the village, not just from a killer, but from the noise and the greed of the world outside. He whistled for Lugs and took his walking stick. "Come on, Lugs. The tide is right, and I have a feeling that lobster is still waiting for us. And since the inspector is so busy in Inverness, I don't think anyone will be checking my pots today." The lazy policeman headed for the sea wall, his gait slow and deceptive, his mind already calculating the best way to spend a long, quiet afternoon. The Highland air was sharp and clean, the snow crunched under his boots, and the world was exactly as it should be. The wandering piper had played his final song, the Sassenach had been silenced, and PC Hamish Macbeth was exactly where he belonged, in the heart of Lochdubh, keeping the peace in his own peculiar and entirely effective way. As the sun climbed higher, casting long golden shadows over the white glen, the only sound was the cry of a lone eagle, and the rhythmic, steady beat of a man who was home. The morning sun, though bright, possessed the watery, pale quality of a Highland winter, casting long, translucent shadows across the pristine white blanket that draped Lochdubh. Hamish Macbeth stood on the sea wall, his long, lanky frame silhouetted against the sparkling expanse of the loch. The air was so cold it seemed to crackle in his lungs, but it was a clean cold, free of the oppressive tension that had hung over the village since Barnaby St. John's orange Porsche first roared into town. Beside him, Luggs was busily investigating a frozen clump of seaweed, his tail wagging with a rhythmic, steady thud against the stone. The wandering piper was gone, the billionaire was in a cell, and the Jacobite gold remained a secret shared only with the silent dead. To any passing stranger, Hamish looked like a man with nothing on his mind but the price of fish, but beneath his frayed cap, he was meticulously cataloguing the peace he had fought so hard to restore. He shifted his weight, his hazel eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of a white and blue patrol car. He knew that the regional office would be a hive of activity this morning, with Blair holding court and the assistant chief constable signing off on the recovery of the citrine brooch. But in Lochdubh, the only activity was the opening of Mrs. Emma Jane's hotel doors and the thin curls of peat smoke rising from the chimneys of the village. The drama was over, and the village, like an old dog after a storm, was curling back into its favourite spot by the fire. Yet there was one final task Hamish needed to perform to ensure the cycle was truly complete, a small, personal act of restitution that didn't involve handcuffs or reports. He walked back toward the police station, his boots crunching in a way that sounded like a satisfied sigh. He didn't go inside. Instead, he reached into the shed behind the station and pulled out a small wooden crate. Inside were several jars of his own home-brewed heather honey and a thick woolen scarf he had liberated from a lost property box years ago. He whistled for Luggs, and together they headed for the small, lopsided cottage at the edge of the village where Archie's mother lived. The boy had been released at dawn, and while the regional team had officially cleared him, the stigma of being dragged away in a police car could stick to a lad like wet wool. Hamish reached the cottage and found Archie sitting on the porch, staring at his boots. The boy looked smaller than he had the night before, his face pale and his eyes clouded with a lingering shock. He looked up as Hamish approached, a flicker of fear crossing his face before he saw the constable's slow, reassuring smile. "It's a grand day for the garden, Archie," Hamish said, setting the crate down on the porch. "Once the snow clears, that is. I suspect the soil will be in fine condition after all this moisture. Mr. St. John's loss is the village's gain, I suppose. I heard the bank is looking for someone to keep the grounds from falling into the loch until the estate is sold." Archie looked at Honey, then Hamish. "The inspector, he said I was a thief, Hamish. He said he'd have me in the big prison for life." "Inspector Blair says a lot of things, Archie," Hamish replied, leaning his back against a porch post, mostly to hear the sound of his own voice. "He's in Inverness now, probably telling the chief constable how he single-handedly saved the Highlands from a master criminal. He's forgotten all about Lochdubh, and I suggest you do the same when it comes to him. You've got a clean slate, lad, and a set of jars that should see your mother through the winter." The boy's face broke into a tentative, shaky smile. "Thank you, Hamish, for coming back to the manor last night." "Och, I just missed the music is all," Hamish lied gracefully. He patted the boy's shoulder and headed back toward the village centre, Luggs trotting happily at his heels. As he passed the post office, Nellie emerged with a bundle of letters, her face a map of curiosity. "So, Hamish, is it true then? St. John was a Jacobite smuggler, and Blair fought him with a bagpipe set? That's what they're saying at the hotel." Hamish assumed his most vacant, wide-eyed expression. "Something like that, Nellie. It was a very complex operation, very strategic. I mostly just held the flashlight, you see. The inspector is a very brave man when he has a car full of regional police behind him." He left her with that morsel of gossip to chew on and headed for the Lochdubh Hotel. He needed a coffee, and more importantly, he needed to see if the interior consultant had made her exit. He found Mrs. Emma Jane in the lobby, looking significantly more relaxed than she had during the storm. "She's gone, Hamish," the proprietor said, nodding toward the stairs. "Penelope Vane left on the early bus. Didn't even wait for breakfast. She looked like she'd seen a ghost, or perhaps just a very angry bank manager. She left a note for St. John's lawyers and enough perfume in room 4 to kill a stag. A ghost, likely, Hamish murmured, thinking of the wandering piper and the tomb beneath the stables. He moved to the lounge and saw Priscilla sitting by the window, a book in her lap but her gaze fixed on the mountains. She looked up as he entered, and for a moment the usual aristocratic shield was lowered, replaced by a quiet, shared understanding. "I hear the village is already writing the legend of DCI Blair," she said, a hint of dark humour in her voice. "He's become quite the hero in the space of 12 hours. "It's the best way, Priscilla," Hamish said, taking a seat across from her. "A hero in Inverness is a man who doesn't have time to be a nuisance in Lochdubh. The piece is worth a bit of a lie." "And the gold?" she asked, her voice dropping. "Exactly where it belongs," Hamish replied, "in the stories, where it can't hurt anyone or make anyone greedy. The Highlands have a way of balancing the scales, given enough time." He stayed for a while talking to Priscilla about nothing in particular. The upcoming sheep sales, the state of the harbour walls, and the likelihood of another storm. It was the kind of conversation that felt like a long, slow exhale after a period of holding one's breath. When he finally stood to leave, the sun was at its zenith, the snow beginning to melt in the eaves of the hotel with a steady, musical drip, drip, drip. He walked back to the station feeling a deep, uncomplicated sense of belonging. He had avoided the promotion, he had protected the secrets of the glen, and he had ensured that the wandering piper would be remembered for more than just a Cornish pasty. As he stepped inside his small, draughty headquarters, he saw a single, silver-wrapped chocolate sitting on his desk. It wasn't an evidence piece, it was a gift, likely left by Mrs. Emma Jane or perhaps Priscilla. Hamish picked it up, peeled back the silver foil and popped it into his mouth. It was rich, dark and sweet, a far cry from the bitter taste of the investigation. He whistled for Lugs, who was already curling up by the stove, and sat down in his favourite chair. The regional forms could wait. The basic logistical support could wait. For now, there was only the ticking of the clock, the warmth of the fire, and the knowledge that the laziest policeman in the north was exactly where he was meant to be. The wandering piper's song had finally ended, and in the quiet that followed, Hamish Macbeth found his own perfect rhythm. He closed his eyes, the deceptive lethargy claiming him. At last, and for the first time in days, Lochdubh's peace was absolute. The afternoon sun began to dip behind the jagged peaks of the Cuillin, casting a long violet shadow across the glen that seemed to pull the village of Lochdubh into a protective embrace. Hamish Macbeth stood by his wood-burning stove, the copper kettle letting out a gentle, domestic hiss that signalled the end of the day's labours. He moved with a deliberate slowness, a man who had successfully navigated the treacherous waters of a murder investigation and the even more dangerous shoals of a police promotion. In his hand was a small, tattered photograph he had found tucked into the back of old Rory's battered wallet, a picture of a young man in a Highland regiment uniform, standing proudly in front of the very stables at Drumnadroshit. He wasn't just poaching Lugs, Hamish murmured, more to himself than the dog. He was visiting his kin. He realised now, with the clarity that only comes when the shouting has ceased, that Rory hadn't stumbled upon the Jacobite tomb by accident. He had been its silent sentinel for 60 years, a man whose family had guarded the secret of the glint in the dark through generations of poverty and change. St. John's arrival had been a desecration of a sacred trust, and Rory had died as he had lived, protecting the only thing in the Highlands that couldn't be bought with London gold. Hamish placed the photograph on the mantelpiece next to a small carved wooden piper he'd kept since childhood. The secret of the tomb would stay with him, a quiet weight that he carried with the same ease as his frayed uniform. A sharp rap at the door broke his reverie. He opened it to find Detective Sergeant Anderson, his car idling in the lane and his face illuminated by the dying light of the sun. He looked at Hamish with a mixture of envy and respect. "He's gone, Hamish," Anderson said, nodding south. "Blair's already in Inverness, demanding a corner office and a dedicated parking space. The Assistant Chief Constable sent this." He said you'd know what to do with it. He handed Hamish a thick, official envelope. Inside was a formal commendation for logistical excellence and a small, blue-ribboned medal for the recovery of the citrine brooch. There was no mention of a promotion, no talk of a transfer, and no suggestion that Hamish should leave his post. The regional office had accepted the narrative Blair had provided, choosing the tidy heroics of a city detective over the complicated truths of a village constable. "I'll put it in the drawer with the others," Hamish said with a modest shrug. "It'll look grand next to the lost property ledger. Give the inspector my best, Anderson. Tell him I hope city life is everything he's ever dreamed of. I think he's already forgotten we exist," Anderson laughed, stepping back into the snow. "He's too busy looking for his next high-profile case. Take care of yourself, Macbeth, and keep that dog away from the pasties." As the patrol car vanished into the dusk, Hamish felt a profound sense of relief. He closed the door, the click of the lock sounding like a final punctuation mark on the mystery of the wandering piper. He sat in his chair, the heat of peat fire seeping into his bones. He had managed to save the boy Archie, keep the tomb of the Jacobites undisturbed, and, most importantly, ensure that his own life remained exactly as it was. To the world, he was a lazy, uninspired policeman who had stumbled through a case. To the Highlands, he was the man who kept the peace by knowing when to speak and when to stay silent. He reached for a thick woolen blanket and pulled it over his legs, the deceptive lethargy finally claiming him in full. Luggs let out a long, satisfied sigh, resting his chin on Hamish's boot. The snow outside was beginning to fall again, a soft white curtain that would erase the last of the footprints from the Drumnadrochit estate. By morning, the glen would be a blank slate, and the story of Barnaby St. John and the pasty-faced killer would begin its long journey into local legend. Hamish closed his eyes, a faint, sceptical smile playing on his lips. He thought of the lobster pot he still had to check, the coffee he'd mooch from Mrs. Emma Jane tomorrow, and the long, quiet winter ahead. He was exactly where he wanted to be, doing exactly what he wanted to do. The Wandering Piper's song had been a tragedy, but the ending, Hamish decided, was a Highland triumph. He drifted off to sleep, the ticking of the clock the only sound in the station, a steady rhythm that matched the heartbeat of the glen. The case was closed, the credit was shifted, and PC Hamish Macbeth was, at last, home.